with your life and Keith's life, and then here, I'm just gonna turn this off
Sure.
just so it's not distracting.
Then we can go back and do the grandparents and parents.
Yep, sounds good.
Actually, I might be smart to do the parents before,
Okay.
because they raised us.
Let's do that. So can you tell me a bit about just like a general timeline of Cecil Perry and Jeanette McDonald's lives?
Yeah, they were both born in 1902, and Cecil Perry died he was about age 65, so it would have been about 1967. He had a sudden heart attack, so he died relatively young. But Mother lived to a very ripe old age. She died in 1995 at age 93. So she was almost, I'm 94 now, so I get that from my mother's side. So she was around a long time. She saw all three boys grow up. But Dad did not. In 67, Keith and I were both launched. We were working, and Tom, but we had not really gone very far. And of course, we all lived a lot longer, so he didn't get that. But let me give you a little bit on my grandparents, just to give on both sides. On my father's side, my grandparents were the McDonalds, and there were Sheffields and Waters. My grandfather's name was David Andrew McDonald. And my father had a brother and a sister. A brother was named David Andrew Jr., and a sister was named Louise. So they were aunt and uncle to us, and we never got to know David Andrew, D.A., he was called, named for his father. We didn't know the grandparents either. I think they knew us and we were wee little kids, but I didn't have any recollection of them. Keith and Tom might have, because they're a little older than I. So I don't know much from personal about my on the McDonald side, but it was my grandfather was David Andrew, and then his son was Cecil Perry, was my father.
And do you know when David Andrew was born and where he lived most of his life?
Yeah, he lived most of his life in South Georgia, but sometime in the, I don't know whether it was 50s or 60s, but sometime he moved to Iola, Kansas. And his daughter lived in St. Louis, Missouri, Aunt Louise, and Uncle D.A. Uncle D.A. lived in Iola, so I guess his parents, I don't know whether he lived in Iola because his parents moved there, or whether his parents moved there because he lived there, but anyway, they were all in Iola, which is a nice town in Kansas, in eastern Kansas, where there's grass and trees,
Yeah.
not just wheat. But I don't know too much about that. My grandmother's name was Waters. She was Mame, I don't know what her real name, but she was called Mame Waters. And she was of Dutch extraction. And she was from Waterville, New York, which is full of Dutch descendants. So, but the McDonalds are from Scotch-Irish, mainly Scotch. And I don't know when the McDonalds came to this country. I suspect early in the 19th century, something like that. The Dooleys, my mother's side, her parents' name her mother was a Beck, Elizabeth Beck, and my grandfather Beck, her father, was a Civil War veteran. He had fought at the beginning of the war. He had just emigrated from Scotland. He had a brother that was living in Iowa, and he got a farm in Illinois when the war broke out in 1861. And Lincoln called for volunteers. He volunteered for the 7th Iowa Volunteers, which is a volunteer regiment being formed. And he fought with that regiment all through the war until 1865. He was captured at the Battle of Shiloh in, I guess it was about mid-1863. He was a prisoner of war, sent down to Alabama. But then they had a thing in the Civil War they called paroles. So if you promised not to fight for 6 months or a year, you could be released, and then when you finished that time, you could come back and rejoin your unit. But that was one way. The South especially had no way to keep prisoners. They couldn't kill them, they couldn't feed them, so the parole was a good way to get rid of your prisoners without having them immediately start shooting back at you. So he did that, and they sent him somewhere on the West Coast for his 6 months parole. Then he came back and rejoined the 7th Iowa Volunteers. He fought, Shiloh and had a number of battles was under Grant. And at the end of the war, he marched in the victory parade down Constitution Avenue.
Wow.
And in the summer of June or July of 1865.
And this was your maternal great-grandfather?
Yeah.
Okay.
My mother's grandfather. The father of my grandmother Beck, who was my mother's mother. So it's the Becks and then the Dooleys. Elizabeth Beck, Pa Beck, well, they call him Pa Beck, I can't remember his first name. But Pa Beck, who was a Civil War soldier, had a daughter. He had several children, but he had a daughter named Elizabeth, who married Andrew Jackson Dooley, who was my mother's father and mother. And then my mother was a Dooley, and she married a McDonald, so she became Jeanette Dooley and McDonald. So that's basically the family background. Tom was born in 1927. Keith was born in 1930. And Tom was born in November 1927. Keith was born in July, 10th to be precise, in 1930. I was born on December 30th, 1931, almost 1932 in 2 days. So we were pretty close together. Tom was enough old, he was 4 years older than, 3 years and plus older than Keith, and 4 years older than I, so we were not close with him. He was 4 grades ahead of us in school and so on. But Keith and I were very close because we were only a year and a half. And we were just 1 year in school. So when I was in first grade, he was in second grade, and so on all the way through high school. And we had a lot of mutual friends, his friends and my friends and his friends. So we were very close. I always loved Keith, and we always got along pretty well. Mm-hmm. And Tom and Keith and Tom were never very close. I was fairly close to Tom because Keith was always interested in science and mathematics and so on, in which he made his career as an engineer. I was always interested in history and politics and books and so on. And Tom was interested in that, so he and I had that in common. But he was 4 years old, so my parents had a hard time with Tom because he was so bright. They didn't know what to do with him. When they came from Mom, I'll give you where we lived in a second, but we lived in Monmouth, Illinois in 1939 to 41. And when we came, and he had been in school there, and when we came from Illinois to Alexandria, Tom was about to begin high school. If he had stayed in Illinois, he would have become a freshman in high school. He had finished 8th grade, I guess. But they had in Virginia, they had at that time an 11-year school. You went to 7 grades in grade school, and then you went to 4 years of high school. So it was a compressed system. So Tom had finished 8th grade, and they told him he had to do the 7th grade over again because Virginia was so much advanced over what they did in Illinois, and he's lasted about 4 weeks because he knew all he had read. He read things, 5 years ahead of everybody else. So after about probably 2 or 3 weeks, they said, "You're right. He should be in high school." So they put him on. But he was very bright in high school too. He didn't go to class. He'd just find out what the syllabus was, look over the books, go and take the exam, and get perfect on the exam. So the high school didn't know what to do with him. So my parents sent him off to college when he was 16 or 17 at St. John's in Annapolis, which took boys, bright boys. It was all boys then. But he only did that for a year, and he didn't take it very seriously then. And it was right in 1945, and he was 17, so he enlisted in the Marine Corps and served as a private PFC in the Marine Corps for 1 year. And at the end in 1940, he went in just, I think he was on the train going to Parris Island for boot camp in August of 1945 when they dropped the A-bomb. And then, of course, the war was over within weeks, but he served 1 year. And then he decided to get rid of all the reserves that had only 1 year enlistments. And he was out, so I know he spent 1 year in the Marines. After that, Tom, I won't go into his whole history, but he spent time in New York at something called New School for Social Research, which was a new university founded in the 30s, which also, where he found a lot of intellectual, and he did a lot of work there. And he went for a while, he taught at the University of Chicago in Illinois.
Oh, he did? I didn't know either of those things, that he was in the school in New York City and in Chicago in the late 40s.
Yeah, 50s. That's where he was. He did that after the Marine Corps. He never took a degree, though. He never stayed at any one place or in one program. He was out there, a couple of his professors, who both of them were very well-known intellectuals in the U.S. academics, who we have letters from them saying he's the best read and brightest man they've ever met. Not just boy or student, but man that they've ever met. So Tom was enormously, so they could just never, the system just didn't allow for somebody who was that smart, that young. Keith and I were both good academically. We got good grades and so on. Neither of us had anything like what Tom had, but he was a real powerhouse. So Tom was that presence in our having. But after his year in the Marines, we didn't see much of him because he went off to New York and lived in New York pretty much the rest of his life.
Oh, really? I thought that he lived he worked for St. John's for a long time in Maryland.
Well, he went to St. John's to college for a couple of years. Then you're right. At the end of his life, he ended up teaching. You're absolutely right. Yeah, he got a job teaching at St. John's. He did teach at St. John's for not a whole lot. I've got in fact, I'll make a copy of it and I'll get it now before I forget about it. I got an obituary for Tom.
Oh, yes, that would be great.
And that gives a whole life history. And you're right, it does. Because I talked to the guy who wrote the obituary, the Washington Post reporter, and he was very interested in Tom. So he went up to St. John's and talked to the dean. And the dean said Tom was probably the best student that they ever had.
Wow. And the system did not know what to do with him.
Nobody did. I mean, St. John's did because they weren't hung up over degrees and so on. But it wasn't until he found St. John's that he really settled into it. And he taught for some time at St. John's. I think up here I may have it. Yes. Yeah, I will make a copy of that for you.
Oh, great.
But you can have a look at it now. So Tom was the real luminary.
Yes, photo of him.
Yeah. That's that picture we have right here.
Oh yeah.
The dog's name is Madeline. Like all of us, he was a dog lover.
Great. Can I take a picture of this?
Oh, sure, you can do that. I was saying I can Xerox you too, but take a picture.
Great. So I didn't know that Tom spent so much time in New York City.
Yeah, until he taught he taught at St. John at Chicago, and I don't remember the dates precisely. One who would know if you are ever interested is Martha, who's his stepdaughter. He married Julie, who had been married before, and she had 2 daughters. And Jenny was older, married, and moved away, but Martha was still in the household. She was in grade school. I used to visit them during the war, during my time in the Marine Corps in the 50s. And Martha was in grade school then, but she lives in Baltimore now. And she got a lot of Tom's papers, and so I have some of them. They could never get, they said if he'd just write something of a thesis, they would give him a doctorate, but he would never. But he wrote a lot of interesting stuff. But you're absolutely right. He ended up with a short career at St. John's, where he's still remembered, I think, imagine.
What was his specialty?
Well, he was a philosopher, basically. He was interested, and he had read all the, and he had read existentialism, Heidegger, and I can't think of him, but he had read all the great philosophers, and so he was very well read in that. But he had an interest in almost everything. He was interested in music. He collected records, classical records. He was interested in art, visited a lot of galleries and so on. So he was sort of a universal man. So that was one of the problems. He didn't want to settle down and become an historian or an English teacher or but he was interested in everything, and knew a lot about everything. So that was his. So he was quite a striking figure for Keith and me to have him in the family.
Yeah, I'm sure for both you and Keith being in your 20s and your 30s, it might have been a bit intimidating to have an older brother like Tom looming over you in a way.
Well, it was sort of, but not really, because we were always, all 3 of us were on very good terms, and just as brothers and so on in the family, so we never felt there was any competition with him. And of course we went through the regular steps and did the degrees and so on, and I got a doctorate and Keith got advanced degrees and I taught in the university. So we had our fairly conventional careers, but Tom was just doing it whatever he wanted to do.
Yeah.
Well, within reason, because he always was working in the academic and intellectual life. But he was a wonderful brother to have, and we all had a good time together. He was close enough that we had did that. I can remember when I guess I was about 9 or 10, we were living in Illinois, in Monmouth, and my father got a puppy for us for Christmas, for the 3 of us. Mm-hmm. And it turned out Keith had asthma, and he was allergic to it, so we couldn't keep it. And Tom and I agreed we wanted to get rid of Keith and keep the dog, but that was the kind of thing. So, so I mentioned Tom because Tom, of course, died some time ago. But he was a great figure in his own way, and he's still, I think, remembered at St. John's. And I think it is somewhere in here where the dean says he probably may have been the best tutor we ever had. Well, anyway, you'll see it when you read it.
I wish I'd known him. So
I'm sorry, you would have liked him, and he would have liked you.
Yeah.
And he'd have something, and he had something in common intellectually with anybody who had any intellectual interest, whether it was music or astronomy or anything. He knew enough about it to be interested in the person. So whatever your particular interest was, literature, I would guess perhaps, but what have you, he was very well read, so he could talk about any novel you wanted to bring up. And so.
And also, work is currently pursuing a PhD in literature. So I'm sure Tom would have been like a great figure for work to know today.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Well, he was a great teacher, but he was made for that kind of teaching. They do at St. John's, which is about 12 people around a big table, and they discuss great books, and they have a program and syllabus and so on, but it's not very stylized. So a lot depends on the leader of the seminar, and they all have to read the books and they have to make talk about it intelligently. He was quite a good teacher, as it turned out. So, anyway, that's Keith. That's Tom, and my father. I might give you. I've told you about my grandparents, what I know, which is not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The Becks were my father, my great grandfather that fought the Civil War. Paul Beck got a farm back in Iowa after the war and lived there, and he had the daughter who married my grandfather, Andrew Jackson Dooley, who produced my mother, Jeanette Dooley McDonald, and who produced Keith and Tom and me. So that's the background on that. That's your background too. Yeah. So, I know less about the McDonald side. My father was born in Georgia, and his parents lived in Georgia. His mother, I think, died young. I never knew either his father or his mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why is that? Do you know?
Well, I was never close enough. When they lived in Georgia, when we lived in Kansas, and we never visited. And then we moved first to Iowa for a couple of years, then to Illinois. First we lived in Kentucky and Missouri and Iowa and Illinois in rapid succession in the late 30s. And none of those grandparents were in Georgia at the time, never no occasion. And we were young too, we were from 4 to 7 or 8, so there's no reason for sort of. We did see my father's sister, Aunt Louise, who lived in Missouri, and she was a wonderful woman. She treated us like she was our mother. I mean, she really, and took us to this says something about the times. This would have been about 1935. Took us to an amusement park, which for two boys, I think it was just Keith and me. It was a wonderful day, and she had every ride you could imagine, the Ferris wheel, the roller coaster, and everything. And I came home and said to my mother, Aunt Louise spent more than $5. And at that time, probably the rides were 10 cents a piece or something. Anyway, she was a wonderful aunt and a very nice person. Her husband was an engineer who worked in oil, and they lived in Venezuela for quite a while he was working for an American oil company.
And this would have been before your time?
Yeah. Yeah, it was in the 30s, and then they came back after, I think, during the war.
Yeah.
They came back. And,
so this is when recently there were operations in Venezuela, and I heard about how there was some American oil infrastructure that was created in the 1920s and 1910s, and that was a justification for for doing these operations in Venezuela. So it's funny to hear a connection with your great grandfather.
Well, it would be my great uncle.
Yeah, with your great uncle working there at that time period.
Well, it could be. I don't know, but I don't even know oil company he worked for. I just knew that he worked in the oil industry in Venezuela. And they were there for some time, but it was in the 30s before the Second War. So, but that sounds like it tracks. It was, at any rate, in a general way, that was the time of big American investment in Venezuela, which ended after the war for various political reasons. So he was part of that general line. I'm never very clear what my grandfather, D.A., did, my father's father. He was always reasonably prosperous, but I have no idea exactly what profession he had.
And your grandparents' generation, they were born in approximately the 1870s, 1860s?
No, my parents were born around say 1902, at the turn of the century. And their parents, yeah, you're right, their parents would have been born probably in the 1870s, 1880s.
And I'm curious about your grandparents. How were they different from Americans today, and how were they similar from Americans today?
Well, I didn't know them well enough, and I don't know the 19th century, but they were essentially 19th century and early 20th century people, so they were of that type. Now, my mother's father, Andrew Jackson Dooley, was an entrepreneur. He ran a lightning rod factory and was quite successful selling lightning rods to farmers all over Kansas. And that's with, plains like that with no trees to catch lightning. Barns and so on are great hazards. The lightning rod was a good business. And he had a big factory in Topeka, Kansas, where my mother was born and raised. In fact, the whole family was in Topeka, which is the capital of Kansas. And that's right in eastern Kansas, very near Missouri. And it's a very nice town. And my mother went to college there. So my grandparents, I don't know much about them before they came to Topeka. I know that Elizabeth Beck, Pa Beck's daughter, who grew up, I guess, in Iowa. But I don't know much about her beyond that.
I know that in the 19th century, the cowboy generation was from approximately, I think it was 1860s to 1880s, and your grandparents immigrated to the West in the 1890s or so, or around then. And it seems like there was a they were part of immigrating from the South or the East towards the West and the Wild West in a way.
Well, that's true. That's pretty true of my father's parents, because they were in the South, and they'd been in the South for generations. I mean, the McDonald's came to Georgia, I think, in the 1800s, and lived in Georgia, and they moved around a little in Georgia, but I don't know, they were farmers, I think, for the most part. And then I think my grandfather had a small business, and I think you suspect he had one in probably in Iola, where he moved, and then again in the West Coast when they moved again. I think it was a shoe store that he had. But yeah, that generation were certainly, they were the 19th century, early 20th century generation. And then my parents were 20th century, but just barely. They arrived just with the 20th century, and they died, both of them, before the end of the 20th century. So they were definitely 20th century. And they saw, of course, enormous changes from when they were kids growing up in Georgia or in Kansas. Although my mother in Topeka, Kansas, it was not that different from what it is today. She went to grade school, which is pretty much like grade schools now, And I mean, the girls looked up, they dressed in long dresses and had pigtail. I mean, you could tell this was 1910 or something. But it was just like my schooling. I went to first grade, second grade, and so on. And it was the same basic system. And it was true for my father too. And they both went through high school. My mother went on to college at Washburn College, which is in Topeka, and graduated there in journalism and worked on the college newspaper and so on. And that was not that drastically different from going to college today. I mean, it is in the sense you've got TV and cell phones and all that stuff today, but in the general idea, you go to college, you live in a dormitory, you go to classes, you do research, you write papers, you read books, that sort of thing. They were doing it in the 1900s the way we do it now in the 2000s. So the college life was not that vastly different. But the surrounding life, there were no electronics, and when in the early days there were no cars to speak of.
Yeah.
That didn't really happen until the 20s. So they were in college before it began to be common for people to have a car. And my father, when he was in college, had a motorcycle, which were quite prevalent. It was much, but he always had a car once he was married. He always had a family car.
The pace of life must have been so much slower.
Yeah, that's true. And the scale of life was a lot smaller too. Stores had less choice.
Advertisements were less prevalent.
Advertising was not as aggressive as it is today. And there wasn't as much of it because you didn't have television and you didn't have color supplements and newspapers and so on. So it was much less obtrusive than it is now. You didn't have radio, you didn't have television and so on.
Yeah, the media landscape must have been just like uniquely newspapers, right? Maybe
Yeah, it was essentially newspapers, and by the late 20s and 30s, radio news came in. People listened to it. I remember when I was a kid in the 30s that you listened to the radio. And when we were kids, when we were 7 and 8, which would have been in late 1930s, we listened to a 15-minute program like Don Winslow of the Navy, of exciting things that you'd see on TV now, and there'd be half-hour programs. These were 15-minute things. Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, so on, and they were on radio. And from about 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, there was a series of 15-minute programs for kids, up through high school kids.
That must have been so much fun.
Yeah, it was. You run to get home in time to hear the next installment, because everything went from day to day. You only got 15 minutes of the story at a time. So that was very different from the day, but it was the same idea, except now it's done on the tube.
Yeah, because you, Tom, and Keith were part of really the first generation to use the radio, for the radio to be to exist.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure of the. Yeah, I think that's right. I think the 1920s there was quite a bit of radio, but was still ooh, you just couldn't be sure what you're going to get, and they were big sets like that. Yeah. By the 1930s, when the sets are about like this, because eventually they got to be like that, but it didn't have the small portable, but you had the small radio, and they were relatively cheap too, for $20 or so you could get a radio, and you could listen to all the programs. It was not hi-fi. The music was not as good as it is now, but you could hear the news programs and the entertainment programs.
Yeah, that must have been a must-have for a 20-year-old in the 1940s.
Oh yeah, no, that's true. Although when I went away to school in 1948, At Andover, one of the first rules they told us was no radios.
Hmm.
They didn't want any boys to have radios. And that's because a radio can become addictive.
Yeah.
And boys spend all their time listening to the radio. And it also feeds a lot of nonsense to people too. So they had a rule, no radios.
Yeah.
And you just could not, and there was no TV, so there was none of that.
Yeah.
But in general, it was, as I say, when I was home in high school, radio was the main source of news. Although newspapers were much bigger then, not in size, but in impact. And Keith and I both delivered papers. I delivered the Washington Times Herald that doesn't exist anymore, but it was a 7-day a week, Sunday and daily. And I had a route of about 50 houses around Delray where we lived. Deliver that. Keith delivered papers, I think the Evening Star. And I took over his route when he left that, and that was a bigger route of 90 or so papers that I remember. And that was a good way to make money, because you didn't make much by today's terms. You made $25 a month or something. And they cost, a week's newspaper cost, the Washington Star, daily and Sunday cost 90 cents. Now it's something like $20 a week or something. It's incredible. But at that time, it was a cheap mode of news. So the newspaper and radio were the news sources.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that Andover had this rule that the boys shouldn't listen to the radio, and it makes me think of how that's like with the next generation, with like John McDonald's generation, it was the television, and then with my generation, it's the internet, and how things don't really change that much.
Yeah.
It's like
that's right.
The medium changes, but
I don't know what the rule, but I bet Andover still doesn't let people use TV or internet. They probably got restrictions on internet, I bet. Andover was a jump ahead to that. I went to Andover in 1948. I got a full scholarship to go. I went there because my mother had been on a trip to the West Coast, and either going there or coming, she read a magazine article in the Saturday Evening Post, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was a very widespread magazine at the time, 1940s, about Andover and what a wonderful school it was, and that it had scholarships for boys that couldn't afford the full freight, and so I applied for one and got one, and it was a wonderful place. It really did, and it was all true because I never had any money, and a lot of the boys were from families that had a lot of money, but it did not matter in the school because the school kept rules like you couldn't have radios, and you couldn't. There was not much you could do to flesh. You couldn't have cars. You couldn't have radios. There was no television. So everybody ate at the same dining hall, and you got Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoon off. You could walk into town and so on. But otherwise, you were living, eating, studying at Andover, and I liked that. It was a very good school, and it was a prep school for the best colleges, because in my class, I think the biggest number went to Harvard, about 70 out of 210 or so boys, about 70 went to Harvard, and something like 55 went to Yale, and about 35 went to Princeton, and then the rest went to places like Amherst, Williams, Wesleyan, good colleges all over, mainly East Coast, but we always had some California boys there, and they would go to Stanford. So, but it really opened up the world to me, and it gave me a chance to get a year in England too, between Andover, and I did a year in England at Christ Hospital School, and came back, and Yale gave me credit for that, so I didn't lose any time. I had 3 years at Yale to finish.
How was the academic environment in Andover regarding like your what the other students were reading and learning about, what you were reading and learning about, and just being
Well,
around
yeah,
those
it was
others?
pretty. Being a secondary school, there was not an enormous amount of choice. Now you could choose whether you wanted to learn French or Spanish or German and so on. You could take 2 languages, which was unusual in high school, but a lot of boys that were there for 4 years would start one in their first year and do it for a couple, and then start another one. So they might end up learning French and Spanish or French and German. They also, at Andover, they taught Greek and Latin for 4 years, or actually they had a post class. I took 3 years of Greek and 2 years of Latin. I had 2 years already in high school, so you could do a lot of classical stuff. And the same thing with science. They had advanced science courses, so they had a lot of things that prepared you for. That was one of the reasons that it was not hard to get a year's credit at Yale, because they knew I'd been through 3 years of high school, then I went to 2 years of Andover, and 1 year of Christ Hospital. So they figured I had enough secondary school that they could let me do it. But I liked Andover a lot, and I liked Yale a lot. And I liked Oxford a lot. They were all 3 very different, but they were different places. And I think Keith liked high school, and Keith was very successful in high school. He got very good grades in science and math. He became president of the student council, which was the biggest post for a student. And he was a star track man. He ran the hurdles. Instead of, he set a hurdling record for the school, for the state, in his senior year. So he had a very successful school career. College, he kind of got screwed up a bit because he went to, I think we've talked about this a bit.
Yes. To what was it? Duke, UCLA, and University of Virginia.
University of Southern California.
Yes.
USC, right.
And he made an appearance in the Jim Thorpe movie.
He did.
And actually, I looked up the VHS cover of this Jim Thorpe movie where Keith is present. And
right.
And he's on the
He's on these steps.
Yeah, I can show you if you want.
Yeah, Jim Thorpe's on the top step.
Yeah, and actually, so I showed it to my friend, and I asked him, right, without him knowing, like, what do you think of this picture? And he like immediately recognized, like, oh, the guy on your left, he's related to you. Oh, here, let me
Yeah, I like to see it. I've seen it a long time ago.
Let me here. Give me a minute.
Well, that was the benefit of being in the University of Southern California, because you were right by Hollywood. And when they wanted athletes, they'd just go to USC and say, send us some athletes.
There we go. There we go. That's Jim Thorpe, All-American.
Yeah, I remember seeing the movie.
And now let's see which. Here,
He's
I can bring
on
it.
the left, yeah.
I can bring it closer if you'd like.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
But maybe.
I've seen it. There is a picture somewhere exists
Mm-hmm.
of Keith on one of the lower, being second or third.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember which one, but on one of the steps below.
Mm-hmm.
Who was it who played Jim Thorpe on?
One more thing that I
Yeah.
like to do is create a little family tree for your parents and your grandparents, so I can
Yeah.
write their name. And so I
Yeah, we can do that pretty quickly.
a few weeks ago I did a DNA test on Ancestry.com
Oh,
just to see, just out of curiosity.
what did they tell you?
They said I'm 1% French, which was a bit shocking. Wait, let me log in.
Yeah.
Then they said it was mostly southeastern English.
Yeah, that's standard English, right? 'Cause that's where London and the home counties are in south of England. That's interesting. We have English ancestors. I've
Here.
never done one of the DNA. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's
There
it's
you are.
neat. So there I am. So as you can tell, it says right here it lists it out. So it's like a southeastern England and northwestern Europe, 66%. And so on
Okay, northwestern Europe, you get Norwegian. That's Scots.
yeah.
That's Irish. Welsh. Ireland. So that's Irish. That's Welsh there. Is the blue the predominant?
So no, so the blue is only 16%. Surprisingly.
Oh, and what is it?
So it says that Central Scotland and Northern Ireland,
Oh, yeah.
16%.
Okay, yeah.
And then the majority is this region right here in green,
That's,
which is 66%, and it says southeastern England and northwestern Europe.
and that's interesting. I didn't know we had any ancestors in the Belgian, Netherlands, well, Dutch, of course.
Dutch,
As
yeah.
I say, my grandmother was Dutch extraction, so that's probably where that comes from. I mean, there are probably others too, but
Yeah, and also in all this, there's also my father's side, and as far
Yeah.
as I know, they've been in northeastern Europe for
Yeah.
for a few generations.
yeah,
But it says I'm only 1% French, so I think that
I can't understand that.
yeah, me neither. I think that they might be counting the part where my father's from in a northwestern Europe up here.
Yeah.
But let's do the family tree. So
Yeah.
I have it here somewhere. Trees. There we go. Okay, so as you can tell, I have my little family tree here.
McDonald.
And what's his mother's name?
Mame, Mayme, Waters.
You said M-A...
YME, I think. I'm not sure. That may have been a nickname, but that's what I've seen.
Okay.
But she was Dutch. I mean, Waters was from... That probably accounts for some of that low country ancestry.
And then what was Jeanette's father's name?
Andrew Jackson Dooley.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Jeanette's mother's name?
Elizabeth Beck Dooley.
Okay.
And her father was a Civil War soldier. I think William Gahn Beck, I think. But had a middle name, G-A-W-N. Can't remember his first name.
And this was Elizabeth's father?
Yeah.
What was his name again?
Well, it was Beck.
Beck.
And his middle name was Gahn, G-A-W-N. And I'm not sure about his first name.
Okay.
But he came over from, he came either from Scotland or Northern Ireland, I'm not sure.
Wow. Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you. This family tree is a little deeper now. It's significantly deeper now.
Hmm?
The family tree is significantly deeper.
Grandmother, but I don't remember any of her earlier. Of course, people lived shorter lives then.
Yeah.
They tended to die at age in their 60s.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Also, so I also have a few questions about
Sure.
like life in the 20th century, right? Because you and really about like how like the evolution of media, where you as you mentioned in your teenage years, you really listening to the radio was a must thing, right?
Yeah.
And it was really fun. And then you saw the rise of television
Yeah.
in your you saw the rise of television in your 30s and 40s, you would say?
No, it would be younger, but
Younger?
television became widespread. I made little sets, black and white, but they become widespread by the 50s. People bought them. And you could watch sports and baseball games like that. There wasn't a whole lot of other stuff to see. But they became, with middle class people, you began like having a radio. You had to have a TV. And I would say by the 50s or 60s, certainly, that they were widespread. Then as they got bigger and better reception and color, which came on fairly rapidly, people kept getting bigger and better and color. So by the time I was in college, by the time I was in the 20s, or certainly in that decade, you were getting color television. So, and at first it was kind of a rich man's toy, and then, but it, like most technology, very rapidly spread so that people could get it, and you got a widespread thing. So the growth of television was very, seems to me in recollection, that it was very rapid. From the after television first was known to exist at the New York World's Fair in 1939.
Mm-hmm.
They had a television station and you could see it, and people thought it was wonderful.
Yeah.
My father was in New York and went to the fair, and he saw it, but none of us saw it. But right after, and it would have probably developed within a year or two, but the war came, so none of that stuff for civilians was being produced. Electronics was all for the war effort. But in 45, it just went like that.
Yeah.
So I say they were very small sets and very poor reception, and all black and white, and not much really, but everybody got them. It was like the spread of radios in the beginning of the 20th century. As soon as they really got reasonably cheap, everybody got one.
And then the television changed from the 50s up until
Well,
the
and
90s.
very rapidly, I'd say by the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
they had pretty much gotten up to the color TV that we have. I don't know specifically, but it wasn't long.
And then also the programming in the television's changed, right? Where I hear that at the start there were like 2 or 3 or 4 channels, right? There was like PBS, CBS, and ABC or something.
That's right. Yeah.
And then I also know that at the end of the 20th century there were a lot of channels, and there was also the 24-hour news cycle, and it's like nonstop.
Yeah, and you're talking about from the 50s to the 50 years.
Yeah, there's a lot of things
All
that
that,
happen.
the number of programs, the size of television, size of the reception, the color, all that came by the end of the century. All that was full blown, and you were getting to the world of 25, 50 channels instead of, as you say, 3 or 4 that we had when we started. But it was a big thing when it started. I remember I gave, in 1948, the year before I went to Andover, I was a Boy Scout. I'd been an Eagle Scout. And for various reasons, the local council wanted a Boy Scout to go when they had the president's tree lighting ceremony behind the White House. They wanted a Boy Scout to make a little speech. So I did that. And I remember Tom, this would be 1948, and I remember Tom said he wouldn't stay home to watch it, but he'd go to a bar.
Mm-hmm.
And by that was the first spread of TVs. Every bar got a TV.
Oh yeah.
That you could go watch the sports and so on. And from there, it just spread
Yeah.
immensely. But I remember in 48, it was still relatively soon, and I'm not even sure whether we probably had one. But, yeah.
And then and now in the 21st century, there's been the internet, right? And how the
That's an incredible thing, yeah.
and it seems like especially with like my generation and the younger generation, the television seems to be like less popular, right? Less like frequently used.
Is that right? Yeah.
And that the internet really dominates things. And so it's interesting to see there's at some point in the 30s and 40s the radio was the big thing. Then from approximately, I'll say the 50s to the 2000s, the television was the main way to communicate. And then in the 2010s and 2020s, it seems like the internet is the main way to communicate.
Mostly, it is true, the last 20, 25 years. Yeah, that's true. Although old people like me don't do as much internet as young people do. We don't watch as much television either. We tend to watch television more than we fiddle with the internet.
Yeah, and I'm sure when I'm your age, I'll be on the internet, and the new generation will be
There'll
doing
be something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I said, no, you finish.
Yeah.
But it has been an interesting development from the newspaper
Mm-hmm.
in the 19th century, and that was really it. If you wanted news, you got a newspaper. Then came radio, which was a revolution. You could hear it, and you could tune it at any time of the day, instead of waiting for the morning or the evening paper. And then the television, and then internet.
Yeah. There's a cultural critic from the '60s called Marshall McLuhan
Yeah.
that popularized the term "the medium is the message."
Yeah.
That really, showcased that that the way in which news is delivered affects like how it's ingested, like its effect, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, McLuhan was a very influential guy. Yeah.
And that at least I was familiar with it from another cultural critic from the 1980s called Neil Postman.
I don't know.
And I guess this first came to my attention when I was trying to understand why Trump was elected.
Yeah.
And it seems like he's the.
Did you ever figure it out?
Yeah, a little bit, kind of. Where it's he's the first like Twitter president, the first internet president. Where
That's true.
like one way in which it helped me I helped I made sense of it is hearing that an infamous debate between Kennedy and Nixon, where people who watched the debate between Kennedy and Nixon on the television thought that Kennedy had done a better job, whereas in people who had heard it over the radio thought that Nixon did a better job.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this was something that Neil Postman cited as the effect of how the message, right? And that additionally I've heard that one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan did so well in the 1980s was because this was the zenith of the television's like cultural power in a way, or power over the news.
No, I think that's true. Well, he had been a movie star.
Yeah, he was made for
He was
television.
made for television. He is perfect. Yeah.
And so with that like logic, I kind of applied it to Trump about how he's made for Twitter, for the internet.
Twitter, yeah,
right?
that's true. I didn't think of that, but it's significant. It's nonsense most of the Twitter that he produces, but he does produce it all the time. Comments on everything.
Yeah, it is nonsense, but it's also like made for this medium.
It is.
And so when I guess a bit of a deeper question that I wanted to ask you about the various the various ways in which in which the news has been dispersed throughout society, is that you saw like political debate in the United States in the 40s and 50s where the radio was present, and then also with the dawn of the television, and when television was at its zenith, right, in the second half of the 20th century, and then now with the internet. And so what so the question is like how throughout your life, how have you seen like various types of media affect public debate?
Well, that's a good topic, because debates did not really impinge on elections until the television debate. You could have had radio debates, and you certainly had plenty of radio speeches, and you certainly had some things that you would now consider debates where people spoke on different sides and so. But we had nothing like before the television debates. The Kennedy-Nixon was the first big one that set the pattern. So that was 1960, something like that. So the whole 20th century had gone for 60 years without debate. Now, as I say, plenty of radio speeches, some of which one would speak against the other, but no national stuff about we're having a big debate between Wilson and Davis, or Harding and it just did not exist, although the speeches did, and the debating in the sense of people giving opposing views. So I would say the era of debate starts with probably with the Nixon Kennedy, and it's followed with debates of other sorts.
That's really interesting. So so that means you were 30 when the Kennedy Nixon debate happened,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
Can you tell me about before in your 20s, right? Before the Kennedy Nixon debate, what how did you make up your mind about who to vote for?
Mainly by reading newspapers. One listened to the radio, but the radio was never as compelling as television is, or probably the internet for all I know. But radio never, I can't remember in my life up to the 30s. I can't remember ever hearing a big time debate, two presidential candidates. It was never anything that was, it might have existed, there might have been it, but I don't remember it, and it didn't impinge on me. And I followed politics pretty closely, and I was a pretty dedicated Democrat. So I think I would have noticed, but I don't have any recollection of that. My vision was mainly from reading newspapers and magazines, Time magazine or New Yorker, or a lot of magazines cover politics. So, and I was very interested in politics, so I read a lot of stuff, and that was probably my main source. And even after the debates, that never was compelling for me. Reading is still more important, and I think that's true of a lot of people. But I think there's a large part of the public that doesn't pay much attention to politics and doesn't have any very strong views one way or another, where the debate is like a horse race. It makes an exciting event, not because it really makes a big difference, but because of the brouhaha about it.
Yeah, like Neil Postman talks about this, about how the like a debate doesn't lend itself to like a strong rational argument for one view or the other. It's more of a of a circus in a way that like Trump like really well epitomizes, where it's or as you said a horse race or a boxing match, where it's like, oh, he got him there, or or this, that, and the other.
He had a good one, yeah.
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 It is, and that's true. I mean, television is sort of made for that kind of very superficial coverage, and television news also does not tend to be very deep. Television all during by the time I was 30, it's 1960s, and we'd had big time television. Television developed pretty far by 1960. But I don't remember getting much of my political views from television. I was interested in seeing candidates when I thought Stevenson was a terrific candidate. And I thought Eisenhower was kind of deadly. So I was interested in seeing them and hearing them. But I didn't see it as the alternative. It was much more what I was reading. But I think for a lot of the general public, the television, by the time it became widespread, it did have more influence on people. But the one thing that you know well, and probably better than I do, but most people get their politics from their parents.
Yeah.
And people change and they get different views, but overall, if somebody had parents that were like what I had, that were very dedicated Democrats, and let's just something happens to overturn it, you stay in that course. And I wouldn't think of being a Republican. I never had. I mean, it's like asking me to be a fascist or something. Something alien to. I consider Republicans a danger to the Republicans.
Yeah.
So Yeah, and I got that, a lot of that, sort of as a kid. Well, when I was in third grade, I guess, third grade, so I would have been about 9. That was the 1940 election between Franklin Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie.
Mm-hmm.
And Wendell Willkie was a very attractive candidate, and he was much less right-wing than Dewey had been, or was later. But I was living in this little town, Monmouth, Illinois, of 9,000 people, and it was 100% Republican. My mother and father would probably represent about 50% of the Democrats in a town of 9,000. I mean, Democrats just did not live in Monmouth. And that was because there was a belt of newspapers. The Chicago Tribune was an extremely right-wing paper run by a guy named Colonel McCormick. And it had radio stations, and it dominated the whole Illinois. And it was right-wing Republican. So almost everybody bought into that. And so that was the dominant opinion. So at that time, when I had to defend the Democrats, because in my third grade class, I was the only Democrat in the class. All the other kids who had also gotten their politics from their children, none of us knew much about politics, but we knew which side we were on. It was like a football game, or
Do you remember your parents listening to FDR's fireside chats?
Yeah, we listened to those pretty regularly, and afterwards, when they began appearing on television, we watched too. No, we admired. My parents did, and of course, my father got that in a natural way because he was from Georgia. And Georgia, after the Civil War, became 100% solid Democrat because Republicans had been the party that made them lose their war, lose their slaves. The Republicans represented all that was evil.
Yeah.
And they got into the Democrats were the only salvation. So, if you lived in Georgia, it was like living in Illinois in my time. You had to be a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And if you lived in Georgia, you had to be a Democrat. And there's still lots of parts of this country, towns and areas where there's a very homogeneous opinion. So my father had been brought up as a Democrat. And if he had lived long enough, he might not have approved it once the Democrats began talking about desegregation.
Yeah.
Because he also was brought up as a racist.
Yeah.
Because in the South,
you
had to consider black people inferior. And he never gave that up because he died before the big revolution. But if it had happened, it would have made him. We would have had to change.
Yeah.
So that's part of the story.
The past as a foreign country. I
I
never made the connection before that. So it seems you put the Kennedy and Nixon debate in 1960 as kind of a marker, right?
That was the first time I'd seen anything like it.
And I hadn't made the connection between the television really becoming more dominant in American culture and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But it seems like they happened, it seems like that wasn't an accident that they happened during the same decade.
I think you're right. And I think television coverage of sit-ins and marches and particularly television showing policemen with clubs beating black people and so on. I got a lot of public sympathy that hadn't cared.
Yeah.
And but most schools are segregated. I mean, when I lived in Virginia, when I lived in Illinois, I don't know whether the schools were segregated or not because there were no blacks.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there were some in town, but there were none in my school that I was. When I got to Andover, it was the first time I ever went to school, and we had one black
Oh, really?
in one class, yeah.
Wow.
Now they have about 10%.
Yeah.
But back in 1948, 49, they admitted maybe one every other year or something. So at any time in the school, there were never more than one or two blacks. And the excuse always was our southern patrons don't like it if you have blacks. And which is true. They hated blacks. So that was a big change. But I think television made a big change in race relations.
Yeah, that is one way where I guess when you have a picture on the screen of these events occurring, it's much more visceral than if it's just written in a newspaper.
I particularly see dogs and clubs and things. Nobody should be treated that way.
Yeah, of course.
And people just trying to get a right to vote and so on. And people, once the issue was raised, began to recognize, a lot of people did, that voting rights should be protected and that they should not be denied it just because they're black and so on.
Yeah.
But in my days in grade school, nobody even thought about it. It wasn't that people were racist consciously, it was just inherent. You did not go to school with any blacks. You did not see them in your stores. The only black I knew, God, I don't know when I first, but when I was in high school, I worked at a clothing store. One, I guess a vacation. And the stock boy who brought the stuff up from the basement and so on at the clothing store was black. And he lived very near me. He lived over near where Fairleigh is now, where eventually, there used to be a little black section there where the high school is now, Alexandria High School. But at that time it was a small black section. He was a very nice kid, and we used to sit around when there was nothing going on, just chat. I liked him. I thought he was a nice kid. But that's the only time I ever talked to a black person. Yeah. I found he was very much like me, that he was, but there was just so few occasions where you could even sit down or have a conversation with somebody. And a lot of that was the blacks were afraid that they would, if they tried to be forward, that they would be paid for it, that there would be retribution.
And understandably so.
And there would be.
Yeah.
So they had good reason. So it was in retrospect, it was a terrible thing for society, and we can thank God we eventually got that.
Yeah.
But it took a hard fight.
And actually, so why would another 17, 16-year-old black boy that was born in the same year as you be scared to spend time with white people? Would it be because there was a violent minority in the white population that would enforce codes of segregation, or was it more of
Well, I mean there certainly were, but I don't think that was the main thing. Rather, there was just an inherent belief in all white people, with very few exceptions, that black people were inferior. And they didn't have to hate them, but they just considered, and they said they were not suitable for white society. And they, it was a emotional thing. It wasn't a rational. If you press somebody on the intellectual basis for it, they would not have stood much chance. And eventually that happened, but when I was a kid, nobody questioned segregation. And it had been so well established, you didn't have to defend it. When I was in high school, there was Parker Gray School on the other side of the tracks, big school that had all the blacks. I never saw any of them. I never did anything We never had any club meetings, we never had any athletics. They were a whole separate world. They were the black, and there was a section of Alexandria that I used to walk through it going to the library when I was, and it was all black. Perfectly safe, but it was, and the world was just organized in such a way that nobody thought to question this. And if you question them, you wouldn't have to go very far before they say, well, I guess you're right, but we still can't change it. So, but that's right. That's why that black boy that I was talking to had to be careful. I didn't.
Yeah.
But he did, because otherwise he might lose his job if my bosses were as racist as the rest of us, and if they thought he was chatting with the customers, they would have pushed him out and said it's not suitable.
Wow. Yeah.
I remember it was interesting because that clothing store, there was one black customer that they would serve. You didn't serve blacks. They couldn't try on clothes. They couldn't. You didn't sell things to them. They didn't come in the store. But there was one guy who was a professor, I think, at Howard University, very well-dressed black man. And they said when he comes in, you wait on him and help him. So a lot of it was a class thing too, because most blacks were poor. So you could look at them and say, well, they're not clean and they're not educated and they don't dress properly. They're not our kind. So you could just dismiss them as being, as you do with poor immigrants today. You look at them and say, we don't know. They don't know our language.
Yeah.
They don't dress like us. They don't. So it's easy to segregate them.
Yeah, and being in Alexandria, Virginia, close to DC, close to Howard University, which especially at the time was probably a mecca of like the high class black people of the 1930s and 40s. Did you have any experiences with any other people?
No, I
associated
didn't
with
know
Howard?
much about Howard, and I never had any run-ins with it. And that speaks for the society. I was taught at George Washington University. Had nothing to do with Howard. Although by the time I was teaching, it was beginning to change.
Yeah.
But in the 30s and 40s, I think at some level there probably was intellectual thing, but not at the student and not at the junior faculty.
And so then, during the 1960s and 70s, what was your experience during the civil rights movement and like the integration of white Americans and black Americans in society?
Well, I always approved of it. I was never opposed to raise it. And part of that was by the time I got to Yale, we had, not a lot, but we had more blacks than I'd ever seen before. So I knew a few of them anyway. I don't think I knew any personally. But I recognized that, it was just blind prejudice, that they were just people. Some good, some bad, some in between. So once, and being a Democrat, since it became a Democratic cause, and of course it broke up the Democrats because the Southern Democrats objected strongly to it. But I went with the mainstream Democratic Party, so I was a supporter of integration. So I never had much of a role in it, but. And by the time when I went in the Marine Corps right out of college in 1954, and Harry Truman had integrated Marine Corps, all services, and so they took in black, and when I became a second lieutenant and went to Japan, one of the lieutenants in my battalion. It was a black guy, tall black guy. His name was Smith. A very nice guy. He had been a basketball star at Santa Clara, or one of the big California universities, and was a very civil, educated, nice guy, and a very good platoon leader. But that's the first time I'd ever had somebody working on the same,
Yeah.
doing the same job at the same level.
That must have been a shock for some of the other Marines
I think
at
it
the
would
time,
have been.
because that was also probably their first experience.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. But he got along very well because he was a jock, and that's a big advantage, too. And he was tall, and he was well spoken, and he did not sound like a black man. That was an advantage too. So he had a lot going for him. He was from California, so he was not a Southern black. So he did not have most of the tags that the stereotype had of being heavy accent, heavy black, and so on. So I think he got well, but I'm sure that he had a constant struggle at that time, because this is 1954,
Yeah.
55. And before the big school desegregation, all the California schools and like Illinois schools were desegregated. There were no separate schools. Virginia was not. We had enough blacks that they had separate schools for them. But that was interesting. But when it got to integration in the 50s and 60s, I don't think I ever did anything very heroic in supporting it, but I always did support it.
Yeah.
I had voted for people who supported it.
And yeah, and then you were. Would you say that you were the last generation to have been raised where like it was just like where segregation was very normal, right? Or I imagine that while Claire and Leslie were growing up, they never, when they were in elementary school, middle school, and high school, they were always in like integrated schools. This wasn't like as like the norm.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I'm not sure when the tide turned, and it'd probably hard to, but my, generally speaking, the people that were middle class, middle-aged adults in the 1960s, I wasn't quite middle-aged, but I was 30-ish, that people like that were the last bunch that had been in grade school and in high school that were segregated and were living in cities that were, and of course it took a long time for that. The school changed fairly rapidly once you got at least it did in Virginia. They integrated by about 1960, but it took about 10 years. Even here, I got out, if I'd stayed here, I would have graduated from high school in 1949, and they didn't become integrated until the 60s, I think.
Okay.
But they did eventually integrate, and they are integrated now. And I always supported that.
Yeah.
But you're right, Leslie and Claire never even knew it existed. Although they both went to private schools where there were fewer blacks than there are in public schools, or some public schools, it depends. Some public schools have very few blacks and some have a lot, depending on what the composition of the surrounding area is.
So the last topic that I wanted to ask you about like living in the 20th century as an American is the Cold War. So as I was born in 1998, so I've only known of the Cold War as a historic artifact.
Interesting. Yeah.
But you lived through it. You actually since we can say started after World War II and it ended in 91. So you really lived through the whole thing. And so what was it? I'm gonna start with just a broad question. What was it like living through the Cold War as an American?
Well, it was a constant presence, but it was kind of sublimated. It was not, I mean, you didn't think about it all the time, but you did if you got in this situation. Or if you read the newspaper and said the Soviets were doing something. And they were the bugaboo with the Soviet Union, as it was at the time, Russia. And they had Eastern Europe. And you knew that when I was at Oxford in the 1960s, Cold War was still on, and we had some guys who had been in what had been Soviet-dominated states that had gotten out, who were now not, but the Cold War separated them. They had to get to England to become free to write and study and so on. So I was well aware of it at every level. It was never the top of my conscience. I would say, interestingly enough, one of the times that was least impressed on me was when I was in the Marine Corps. Because the Marine Corps, you're there to fight, but it doesn't make much difference who you're going to fight. You're just training whoever the president says to fight, you will fight. So you didn't think, I'm getting ready to fight the Russians or I'm going to fight the Czechs or so on. You just thought, we will attack when we're told to attack. So I did not, I would say, and I think that never thought of it, but I suspect the U.S. military during that Cold War period was one of the least active. That's not that there were some crazy generals and so on that talked about the Red Menace and so on, but I think the military in general, and certainly the junior officers and the enlisted, the bulk of the military, the people that do the actual fighting, I don't think it had made much impression on them. It certainly did not on me, and I spent a year at that time in the Marine Corps in Japan, and it just wasn't part of the world to be afraid of the Russians, or the Japanese, or anybody else. Chinese, maybe.
Was there a certain decade where it was more present than other decades, right? When you think about in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s.
Well, I think it was not so much decades, because I don't think it ever was that thing. But there were events, like the Berlin blockade in '48. That was a direct threat. They were trying to isolate Berlin and take it over. So that was a threat of Soviet, what was seen at the time as Soviet expansion, taking over Berlin. We were determined to protect Berlin, and we flew coal and supplies because the Russians wouldn't let us drive across East Germany. So that was an immediate crisis, and there were a lot of military that were disposed nearby that would have been ready to fight. So those are the time, but that didn't last the whole decade. That was over by 49 or 50. And the Korean War was another case. North Korea was clearly supported by Russia. Probably not as much as we thought it was, but the American impression was South Korea is just fighting a war on behalf of the Soviet Union, because North Korea was a communist state and it had a lot of ties with Russia, and a lot of Russian aid, and so on. So you saw that was a Cold War, and that was a 3-year war. So during that period when you were, and I just missed that, but because I went in the military in '54, and the war was essentially over by '53. But a lot of my friends served during Korea, and they were on front lines against the North Koreans, and some were wounded and so on. But that, I can't think of, I'm looking over the Cold War. Berlin, Korea, I can't think of what else, but when you had an international crisis, that's when you worried about a possible Third World War. But most times you didn't, because it didn't seem likely. And of course it never happened, so.
So it's not, I shouldn't think about it from like a decade to decade, but more from event to event, right? Where for example, in 58 something happened, but then in 48 something happened, right? But then 49 it cooled down, people would think about it less. Then in 52
then the war, in 50 the war breaks out, it was Korea. So it rises again. 53 the war was over, it cools down.
Okay.
So I don't think you could characterize whole decades as one being more Cold War. That it was a constant. I mean, it was assumed,
Mm-hmm.
sort of like racism we were talking about. You just assumed that the Russians were a menace,
Mm-hmm.
and they had nuclear weapons, and if they saw a good opportunity, they wouldn't mind starting a war with us.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just part of your world. But as long as they weren't making immediate menace, it was put on the back burner and you didn't pay much attention to it. But that's an interesting question because I really don't remember, except for the one that I mentioned, Berlin, Korea, much where there was real strong feeling about an imminent war.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's those are the three topics I wanted to talk about regarding
good.
the 20th century after the family history. Yeah. I'm gonna stop the little recording. I'll send you the video. And again, it's just like as a